Muchísimas gracias a todos por acudir a esta conferencia sobre un tema tan espinoso y tan actual como las relaciones entre fe y saber, analizadas a partir de la crítica de Habermas a Hegel y de la posible respuesta de Hegel en boca de Andrew Buchwalter a Habermas. La conferencia va a ser en inglés. Las personas que no se manejen bien con este idioma pueden seguir la traducción que tenemos en papel y que se ha dado a todas las personas. Me dice ahora mismo Andrew que va a suprimir alguna frase muy pequeña que está en la traducción, pero que básicamente el texto va a ser el mismo. Y para el debate posterior, yo, como pueda, actuaré de intérprete y de traductor. Quiero agradecer pues la presencia de todos ustedes, particularmente la presencia también de los doctorandos del Instituto de IDSBA, Institute of Doctoral Studies for Visual Arts, que nos visitan desde los Estados Unidos. También veo alumnos del Máster en Filosofía de la Historia y también muchos socios del Círculo y público corriente. Voy a presentar muy brevemente a Andrew Buchwalter, que es buen amigo desde hace tantos años, una persona crucial en los estudios hegelianos a nivel mundial y desde luego en los Estados Unidos. Ha tenido importantes responsabilidades en la Hegel Society of America y es desde hace bastantes años Presidential Professor del Departamento de Filosofía de la University of North Florida en Jacksonville. Ha trabajado en diferentes aspectos, relacionados con la obra de Hegel, no solo desde un punto de vista histórico o historiográfico, sino sobre todo intentando ver cómo su filosofía puede seguir dando respuesta hoy en día a problemas de nuestro tiempo. Y la conferencia de hoy va a ser un magnífico ejemplo. Lo son también sus publicaciones, que son muchísimas. Aquí pues voy a mencionar solo 3 de ellas. Uno es el libro que publicó en Routledge titulado Dialectics, Politics and the Contemporary Value of Hegel's Practical Philosophy. Tiene un libro también editado muy importante sobre Hegel and Global Justice, Hegel y la justicia global, sobre las respuestas que puede dar Hegel a los desafíos del cosmopolitismo político, y un libro también muy importante, que aunque no tengo aquí, pues es fundamental, que es Hegel and Capitalism, sobre las relaciones desde el día de hoy entre Hegel y el capitalismo. Muchísimas gracias a Andrew por venir, por preparar este texto tan interesante y tan rico que, repito, tienen en traducción las personas que lo quieran seguir en este idioma, y a continuación pues haremos el debate en este mixto entre inglés y español, con lo cual siéntanse libres de hacer sus preguntas o en inglés o en español y yo traduciré.
Okay.
Now, Andrew, thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Valerio, and the Círculo de Bellas Artes for the invitation and for the unique opportunity to present a paper to such a diverse and distinguished group of scholars and interested community members. It's really an honor to be here. My only regret is that I still haven't sufficiently mastered Spanish. I've told Valerio that maybe when I retire, I will move to the outskirts of Madrid and be then compelled to speak, and then maybe there might be a possibility to come back again and present something if there's an interest in Spanish. Okay. In any event, in this paper I discuss the 2019 book Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie. English is This Too is a History of Philosophy by the great German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, whom I believe now is 94 years old. He wrote this book in his 1,700 pages in his 90s. This is a monumental work published in 2 volumes. I don't know, I'm certain it will be translated into Spanish, perhaps it's already been translated, I'm not aware yet, but German books are usually translated very quickly into Spanish, so it should be there soon. And I'm going to be very critical of the book, but that's not to take anything away from its significance. This is really a very important book. In this work, Habermas seeks to demonstrate how certain ideas and values central to the development of Western thought and culture, scientific objectivity, human dignity, impartial justice, human progress itself, had their origin in the world's axial religions. That's a term taken from the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, axial religions. These include these great world religions, Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, as well as classical Greek philosophy. In tracing out the lineage, Habermas' aim is at least twofold. First, he seeks to reaffirm the merit and legitimacy of core Western values like individual freedom, human rights and dignity, collective political autonomy, universal moral norms, against threats like scientific technological reductionism and tribalistic nationalism. Second, against religious fundamentalism, he also wants to defend an account of religion, at least compatible with secular values of Western civilization. In forging this connection between religion and the secular, Habermas also reaffirms the central aim of his earlier work on the role of religion in the public sphere, to advocate for a rich and differentiated modern political culture receptive equally to the concerns of interests of both believers and non-believers alike. So he's trying to fashion a sort of a very rich public sphere that's as inclusive as is possible. In this paper, I consider the central role Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, another great German philosopher. Habermas is sometimes considered the Hegel of the 20th century. Hegel himself was the Hegel of the 19th century. The role played by Hegel in Habermas's genealogy of Western thought. After briefly delineating what Habermas thinks is both good and bad in Hegel's position, I proceed to challenge, on many counts, Habermas's reading of Hegel. My ultimate goal is to indicate ways in which Hegel's account of the relationship of religion and secularity is on some points superior to that of Habermas. So there's going to be some sort of interpretive, exegetical discussion, and then some more systematic philosophical points. In the interest of time, I may make a few deletions from the distributed paper. For those following the Spanish translation, these should be minor and really won't be too disruptive. So, it is 2019 auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie.
Sorry to interrupt you, Andrew. Aquí es donde empieza el texto que os hemos repartido y hasta ahora lo que ha hecho ha sido una contextualización. I will do it very, very briefly. Contextualización del libro de Habermas, este monumental libro de 1.700 páginas que trata el rol de la religión, ¿no?, entre otras muchas cosas, en la esfera pública, y bueno, ha tratado un poco la cuestión que, digamos, Hegel, ¿no?, va a ser el centro de su intervención, y a partir de ahora pues ya se va a empezar con el texto que hemos repartido. Sorry for the short interruption.
Well, if that explained things better, so much for the good. So, in this book, Habermas defends a vision of what he calls post-metaphysical thought, a very important category for Habermas, the post-metaphysical. Metaphysics is bad for Habermas. We have to focus on the post-metaphysical. He defends post-metaphysical thought from the perspective of an account of the relationship of faith and reason as it played out primarily in the history of Western philosophy. He also deals with non-Western, but primarily it's Western philosophy. Central to this, what he calls the genealogy of post-metaphysical thinking, is an effort to redeem and recast for contemporary thought crucial insights and assumptions introduced to human civilization during what, as I mentioned before, Jaspers following Jaspers, Habermas calls the axial age. Occurring roughly between 800 and 200 BC, the axial age reflected the ascendance of the major world religions, including, as I said, Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, subsequently Christianity, as well as classical Greek philosophy. Common to all these movements was an affirmation of the principles and values that were later central to the development, above all, of Western thought and culture. Among others, these principles and values included the idea of objective validity for science, the worth and equality of all individuals, a commitment to the welfare of humankind generally, and an expectation that human affairs will be governed by binding and impartial standards of justice and morality. So all these values that some people associate with the Enlightenment, Habermas is claiming can already be found in these world religions. And Western thought is then subsequently sort of playing out of some of these originally established values. Over 1,700 pages, Habermas presents the ensuing history of Western thought as a learning process in which the principles and values bequeathed to humanity by the axial age are further clarified while also gradually purged of the metaphysical and theological baggage that had impeded their proper articulation. As a provisional endpoint of this process, Habermas offers his own conception of communicative reason. At issue is a notion of rationality committed to the general norms of objective validity, impartial truth, human equality, and historical progress, where such norms are understood not as the expression of a transcendent absolute authority to which humans are vertically related, but in terms of an immanent, horizontally directed, and fallibilistically conceived practice through which historically situated social agents together fashion the conditions of their shared existence. So basically, Habermas is saying, okay, everything that was said in the axial age is right, but it was understood of man towards his vertically transcendent authority. I want the same things, but now horizontally related among human beings and sort of affirming the principles of God without God. Central to Habermas's genealogy is Hegel, to whom he devotes 2 chapters. Hegel is important because his account of objective spirit initiated a move away from Kantian transcendentalism in favor of the domain of actual history, society, and culture, so important to a communicatively conceived notion of post-metaphysical thought. I mean, this is Hegel's concept of objective spirit. Reason has to be now concretely rooted in society and history, and rejecting this sort of ahistorical transcendentalism of Kant, even though Hegel still reaffirms the notion of rationality and reason that we find with Kant. However, Habermas continues, by retaining Kant's and modern thought's commitment to the philosophy of the subject, Hegel wasted the detranscendentalizing potential residing in a theory of objective spirit. Indeed, by interpreting the objective embodiment of reason as the manifestation of a self-enclosed and divinely conceived notion of absolute spirit, Hegel not only restored the metaphysical tradition rejected by Kant, but did so by conferring divine authority on a hereditary monarch who in his singularity was deemed to instantiate political community itself. In this way, Hegel also undermines the crucial notion of human beings as agents of autonomous self-legislation. For Habermas, the concept of rational freedom, the German is vernünftige Freiheit, really crucial concept in Habermas, which he takes over from Kant. This concept of rational freedom, central equally to Kant's practical philosophy and in its detranscendentalized form to Habermas's own theory. So, I mean, it's a sort of complicated idea, but so the big problem with Hegel for Habermas is this idea of the philosophy of the subject. Hegel understands everything in terms of this paradigm of the subject, which goes back to Descartes through Kant and Fichte, whereas Habermas says we have to move away from subjectivity to intersubjectivity, or communication rather than internal introspection. So everything that's wrong with Hegel is because he still adheres to this philosophy of the subject. Of course, I reject this reading, but that's Habermas's position. Okay. It's really important, though, for his position. So basic to Habermas's critique of Hegel is the claim articulated in a certain section of the book, of Volume 2. And the claim for Habermas is that Hegel assimilates faith to knowledge. He makes faith into knowledge. Sort of an interest, well, in leveling this charge, Habermas focuses on Hegel's specific understanding of the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, Menschwerdung, the incarnation of the divine. Inasmuch as God is deemed to be manifest in the lives of finite human beings, Christian belief can be restricted to witnessing and cognitively acknowledging the divinity fully present, already present in human existence and experience. Habermas makes a similar point with regard to Hegel's treatment of religious sacraments, an issue addressed in the latter's account of the religious congregation, or the cultus. On Hegel's view, sacraments and other, according to Habermas, sacraments and other religious rituals are not simply practices through which individuals either confirm membership in a religious community or reaffirm their relationship to the religious traditions comprising such membership. These are elements of the enlightened view that Habermas claims finds expression in the thought of Hegel's contemporary Friedrich Schleiermacher. Inasmuch as such sacraments, and Habermas references in particular the Christian Eucharist, are viewed by Hegel as themselves manifestations of the divine. The divine is present in these sacraments themselves. Ritualistic worship assumes the form of a believer's cognition of the truth of a Christian doctrine as already revealed in the practice. In neither case, then, does religiosity connote practices by which believers cultivate their own spirituality or participate in activities that contribute to realize the divine in the world or the realm of God on earth. In other words, it's simply a cognition of something already there. It doesn't require of believers any action or activity on their own. Instead, religious belief is, on Habermas's view, an exclusively epistemic phenomena, not a practical, epistemic phenomena, one expressive for Habermas of a Gnostic focus on the direct apprehension of the divine, something itself promoted by the Neoplatonic emanationism infusing Hegel's idea of incarnate spirit. So there's a lot of different things that Habermas is introducing here and tying them to Hegel. But the upshot is that the divine is already fully present in human experience, so all we humans have to do is observe it. You know, we don't have to do anything to realize the divine ourselves. There's no practical expectation. So the implications of Hegel's conjunction of faith and reason are, in Habermas's view, wide-reaching. In embracing this cognitive view of religious belief, Habermas rejects conventional Enlightenment views regarding the separation of faith and knowledge, even aligning himself with elements of the counter-Enlightenment. In asserting that faith is nothing more than the cognitive acknowledgement of a divine truth already present in the human soul or in sacramental practices, Hegel eliminates, according to Habermas, from his account of religion, attention to the principles of individuality, freedom of will, and moral responsibility that Habermas still claims have been bequeathed to modern thought by the Judeo-Christian tradition and generally the axial age itself. Moreover, inasmuch as the truth of Christianity's incarnate divinity concretizes itself, given Hegel's commitment to the philosophy of the subject, In the personage of the constitutional monarch, secular citizenship itself involves little more than the devotional loyalty directed to acknowledging the legitimacy of state power. Finally, because a polity, and indeed reality itself, are construed as embodiments of absolute truth, a philosophy directed to scrutinize the rationality of political institutions becomes little more than the accommodationist insight into necessity and the speculative comprehension of what is. This is the traditional criticism of Hegel, that he conjoined reason and reality, and philosophy is just the speculative affirmation what Karl Marx called the metaphysical benediction of existing reality. In other words, there is no critical component. So in what follows, I question this reading. Given the significant number of issues raised by Habermas, my engagement is necessarily limited. Thus, I shall not take up in any detail the question of whether Hegel's general approach to philosophy involves an uncritical affirmation of existing reality, although that's a very questionable thesis that has been much challenged in the literature. Nor shall I address in any detail Habermas's characterization of Hegel as a philosopher of the subject, a characterization which is accurate but fails to take into account the nuanced nature of Hegel's position and the significant way in which it differs from other thinkers, from Descartes to Fichte, who have also been characterized in this way. So, yeah, Hegel is a philosopher of the subject, okay? But there are many different types, and Hegel, there's Descartes and there's Hegel, and they're not the same, you know? And Habermas sort of groups them all together, basically saying that Hegel's a Cartesian, and you know, but it's a long story to discuss that, so I'm going to leave that. I'm just going to say that's wrong, and I'm going to turn to other things that are more immediately wrong. So these are both important issues bearing on the nature and merit of Habermas's assessment of Hegel's position. For the purposes of the present discussion, however, I focus on somewhat more narrowly on Habermas' assessment of the relation of Hegel's thought on religion, reason, and secularity or secular politics. My remarks are divided into 5 parts. In part 1, I detail Hegel's general notion of faith, contesting Habermas' view that it is a narrowly epistemic account that precludes requirements for practical agency. In part 2, I continue this analysis by focusing on Hegel's concept of the religious community or the cultus, asserting that here too Hegel's position incorporates the practical dimension deemed by Habermas to be absent. In part 3, I question Habermas' contention that religiosity for Hegel is an otherworldly phenomena unconcerned with the practical concerns of everyday life, arguing instead that the very idea of cultic community demands for Hegel for its proper articulation attention to those worldly concerns and conditions required for their realization in the mundane sphere of social political life. In part 4, I argue that while Hegel does ground his political thought in religious considerations, this typically has the effect of empowering rather than, as Hegel claims, undermining elements of a modern account of a secular polity. So I'm saying, yeah, Hegel does say modern political institutions are rooted in religion. That can have problems, but it doesn't necessarily have problems, and it doesn't have the problems that Habermas says they have. I mean, it's a very big question. What are there religious foundations of even Enlightenment thought, you know? So in the final part, I conclude by considering some more systematic issues raised by the two thinkers' respective understanding of the relationship of religion and secularity. So some issues, I hope we have time to get through most of them. So in any event, central to Habermas's reception of Hegel's treatment of the relationship of faith and reason is his criticism of the way in which Hegel's philosophy of religion engages certain core tenets of tenets of Christian theology. In particular, Habermas maintains that with the reception of the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, Hegel fashions a wholly epistemic view of faith, one that removes from the individual believer concerns for moral responsibility and self-cultivation in favor of the cognitive acknowledgement of a divinity already presumed to inhere in the human soul. Yet it is doubtful that this view does justice to Hegel's position. Thus, while it's true that Hegel espouses a cognitive view of faith, he does so broadly with reference to a notion of rational reflection expressive as well of freedom and self-determination, consistent with his characterization of genuine religion as free intelligence. That's his definition of religion, freie Intelligenz. He claims that faith involves the believer's volitional as well as epistemic embrace of the divine. Faith denotes the form of action, he says, in which the finite individual knowingly and actively brings forth his or her own union with God. Indeed, an authentic account of faith is itself practical. It depends on the believer's ability to make his or her own any content that may be externally or contingently given as its basis. Summarizing his expectation for the person of faith, Hegel writes, quote, "The religious principles should not merely lay claim to him, the person of faith, as external laws and precepts of authority to be obeyed, but have their assent, recognition, and even justification in his heart, sentiment, conscience, and intelligence." So these are not things that simply have to be accepted as given, rather they have to be justified by a believer and practically made their own. The point obtains especially for Hegel's account of modern religiosity, which he identifies with Protestant Christianity. Maybe in Spain, it's not good to say this, but Hegel was not a big fan of Catholicism. He thought it was a religion of Unfreiheit, a religion of unfreedom, but that's maybe something we can discuss. But in any event, he claimed that Protestantism was the religion of freedom. Directed to the priesthood of every believer, it is rooted in, quote, the self-sufficient and inherently infinite personality of the individual, the principle of subjective freedom, end quote. Central to the idea of Protestant freedom is the expectation as regards the union with God. Individuals must, quote, accomplish the reconciliation in themselves. It's up to individuals to forge the reconciliation of man and God. Indeed, Hegel maintains that as regards the Protestant view of religious worship, such freedom alone should be considered. That's the only thing that he claims should be considered. Skipping a sentence, his conjunction of faith and knowledge thus cannot readily be said to entail a repudiation of modern notions of practical rationality. Part and parcel of that conjunction is precisely an affirmation of modern notions of freedom and self-determination. None of this is to suggest that Habermas is wrong to claim that for Hegel the divine is already present in the soul of the human being. Yet saying this is not also to say that Christian faith is nothing more than the cognitive witnessing of that presence. Doing so is wrong for several reasons, but the most important here is that it misrepresents the sense in which for Hegel the union of the human and the divine speak to the spirituality of human beings, the Geistigkeit for Hegel. Habermas is correct in asserting that human beings instantiate a notion of spirit, Geist, understood as an absolute that conjoins substance and subjectivity. That's Hegel's definition of Geist. Yet the absolute in question is not one that simply objectifies itself in the experience of human beings, defined as the process of rendering substance as subjectivity. The realization of spirit or Geist also depends on processes in and through which human beings enact and effectuate the unity in themselves. Habermas is correct to note that for Hegel, faith involves acknowledging, in Hegel's words, the existing an sich seiende unity of the divine and the human. Yet for Hegel, spirit is properly real not only in itself, an sich, but also for itself as well. And it is only when human beings explicitly appropriate for themselves what might be antecedently or implicitly given that the spiritual conjunction of the human and the divine is properly achieved. Hegel may say that faith is the witness to spirit. Yet human beings bear witness to their spirituality, not just in acknowledging it, but in actualizing it as well. Religious faith does take the form of cognition, but on Hegel's view, rejects any binary view of the relationship of knowledge and volition. Such cognitive certification goes hand in hand with activity directed to effectuating the union of the human and the divine. Hegel's position may be compared to the non-cognitive theology of feeling espoused by Hegel's fellow Protestant Schleiermacher. In the book, surprisingly to me, Habermas comes out very strongly in support of Schleiermacher and against the greater rationalist Hegel, but okay. According to Habermas, who presses the comparison of Hegel and Schleiermacher, Schleiermacher is the more modern thinker, as his distinctions between the respective modes of faith, reason, and morality affirms, if in a distinctive way, the conceptual differentiates associated with other modern thinkers, above all Kant. You probably know the Kant famous three critiques, knowledge, practical reason, and aesthetic. So Kant said modern reason is divided into the three things. So Schleiermacher, by adding faith to the mix, is continuing that same type of differentiation. And Habermas thinks, well, that's great. You know, that's highly modern thinker. It doesn't see everything as part of one big whole. Yet here, too, questions can be raised about Habermas's appraisal. Here we'll leave aside whether, for Hegel, Schleiermacher's differentiations do indeed exemplify modern assumptions. Instead, it suffices to note that on other counts, Hegel's arguably at least as modern as his Berlin colleague. Schleiermacher and Hegel both taught at the University of Berlin. For Schleiermacher, a theology of feeling, that's Schleiermacher's Gefühlstheologie, a theology of feeling focused on human beings' sense of dependence on God. In this way, Schleiermacher, according to Hegel, not only identifies religion with a naturalism at odds with its presumed spirituality, but assigns to faith a heteronomy and external determination at odds with the notion of freedom entailed by a constitutive spirit, understood as a conscious rendering of substance as subjectivity. Indeed, if freedom is the defining feature of modernity, and for Hegel, this is a legacy of Protestantism itself. Protestantism is what brought this concept of freedom into the modern world. Not feeling or dependence, but freedom. If freedom is the defining feature of the modern world, then Hegel, in my view, arguably propounds the more modern view of faith. Habermas claims that, sort of literally, who is the more modern thinker? He said Schleiermacher or Hegel. Well, Habermas says Schleiermacher. I guess maybe a little childish, I say that Hegel is the more modern thinker. This is not to suggest that Hegel denies the dependence of human beings on the divine. God is, quote, the unlimited foundation and cause on which everything depends, unquote. On Hegel's view, however, relations of dependence are not inimical to a robust account of freedom. Proceeding from a notion of freedom as selfhood in otherness, itself an element in a concept of spirit understood as the conjunction of substance and subjectivity. Hegel maintains that freedom is part and parcel of an interdependent account of dependence and independence. In the present case, human beings best affirm their own autonomous identity, their freedom, only in acknowledging their relationship to an other that subsists beyond the parochial immediacy of everyday self-interest, just as the divine itself affirms its status as an absolute or infinite only as finite human beings cultivate their own spirituality. Okay, I'll leave out that final paragraph in this section. So section 2 here. Similar observations may be made about Habermas's treatment of Hegel's conception of the cultus. What is cultus in Spanish?
Culto.
Culto. The name for the religious communities that constitute a core element in Hegel's philosophy of religion. Habermas notes how religious communities have ever played an important role in Hegel thought, from the early texts written or co-written during his time in Tübingen, when he was very young, to the lectures presented during the final Berlin period. In the early writings, for instance, Hegel assigns to the idea of a civil religion, Volksreligion, the task of responding to and rectifying the tensions and polarities or bifurcations, the German is Entzweigungen, all the tensions, the contradictions of the age. Habermas further observes that elements of that same goal inform Hegel's final work on religion. But in these works, Habermas continues, any melioration or elimination of societal tensions is not forthcoming from members of the cultus themselves. Instead, reconciliation is now the function, again, of an absolute spirit, which, articulated again in the Christian idea of the incarnation, autonomously and anonymously surmounts the bifurcation it itself creates. So God simply creates these divisions only to overcome them. That's the only role that these oppositions have at the end for Hegel, according to Habermas. So instead, reconciliation is now, I said that. So on this view, cultic communities participate in the phenomena of bifurcation simply by giving expression to a notion of absolute spirit that consolidates its self-identity through objectification of the finite experience and practices of those members of those communities. Yet participation does not involve in any meaningful account of practical agency on the part of those members. Claiming, as he does, that the rituals and practices of a cultic community, special attention is accorded to the Eucharist and the Last Supper, are themselves living embodiments of the divine. Hegel, for Habermas, holds that believers engage the absolute simply by witnessing the Spirit manifest in those sacraments. So the Eucharist already embodies, they're not just things Christians do, rather they express the divine themselves. Yet again, Habermas's reading of Hegel can be questioned. While clearly Hegel did see in the sacramental practices of cultic communities instantiations of the absolute, he did not thereby reduce religious worship to the cognitive acknowledgement of a supervening truth already inherent in the practices themselves. Instead, here too, Hegel espouses a practical view of faith, one that reposes on the cognitive and volitional agency of believers. It is only in the believer's active engagement of the divine and its appropriation for their own lives that the absolute assumes reality for them. As regards then the rituals like the Last Supper or the Eucharist, such rituals do provide occasion for believers to affirm their union with God, and yet the union itself is achieved only as believers forge the union itself, something itself achieved only as they reconcile their finite existence with the infinite. Quote, I am to make myself such that the Spirit dwells in me, end quote. True, the achieved unit ultimately takes the form of a consciousness of such unity, yet that consciousness is available only through quoting again, human labor, the work of spirit that first creates it. Indeed, in line with the concept of spirit, again understood as the subjective rendering of substantiality, the spiritual consciousness is itself just the awareness of the process by which the believer establishes for him or herself the spiritual significance of the sacraments. Moving to the next paragraph, Hegel's point, though, is not simply that each member of a cultus forges his or her own private union with the absolute. Rather, the absolute is fully realized only as members of a cultus forge a shared identity, a union with one another. In participating in cultic rituals, the believer, according to Hegel, becomes spirit and thus a citizen of the kingdom of God, end quote. Such spirituality is achieved only as believers appreciate and affirm their shared membership in that kingdom. The cultic consciousness of the union with God is also, quote, the consciousness of union with absolute spirit as the universal spirit of a people, end quote. Hegel's position on this matter can be clarified by considering the role of love in the union of the human and the divine. Doing so makes additionally clear that participation in cultic practices is more than a merely epistemic phenomena. I mean, well, I don't. If you want to say that love is epistemic, then maybe there is an issue, but it's still.
Let's go into details.
Hegel characterizes love as experience of selfhood, and this is a famous definition of love for Hegel. And in love, quote, we are not one-sidedly win on ourselves, but willingly limit ourselves with reference to an other, even while knowing ourselves in this limitation as ourselves. In this determinacy, the human being should not feel determined. On the contrary, he attains his self-awareness only by regarding the other as another. So love is only when one finds oneself and affirms the other. So understood, love finds its, what Hegel calls the infinite or the highest form in a human being's relationship to God. As the ultimate other, God best enables human beings to appreciate what love demands, recognition of self in the other. Further, in sacrificing him or herself for God, the finite human being most fully enacts the self-limitation, what Hegel calls the infinite anguish, the unendliche Schmerz, required for love's unconditional recognition of the other. Yet love of God cannot be narrowly restricted to an individual's private relationship to the divine, however important that may be. A love that is truly infinite must also encompass love of one's fellow human beings. To love God, Hegel says, is to love one's neighbor. In Hegel's words, love of God takes the form of, quote, the mutual love of the community, end quote. A love predicated on recognizing the other as other requires a form of community shaped by modes of reciprocal recognition. In this respect, it is in this respect that Hegel asserts that ethical life, the German is Sittlichkeit, his name for a community quintessentially expressed in relations of reciprocal recognition. Sittlichkeit, quote, is the most genuine cultus. So a cultus is very much a social, intersubjective phenomena for Hegel, in my view. To say that love of God requires the mediation of community is not to say that it is reducible, however, simply to relations of human sociality. Any love among community members must still be infused with the love of God. Invocation of ethical life must be directly bound up with, quote, a consciousness of the true, of the divine, of God, end quote. A human community devoted to relations of reciprocal recognition takes the form, ultimately, of a, quote, universal community, end quote, committed to the idea of a, quote, universal justice, end quote. Undergirding the latter, however, is the consciousness of God before whom alone, Hegel claims, all human beings are equal. It's only before God that we're all equal. That consciousness, moreover, is itself facilitated by the infinite anguish of divine love, that requiring human beings to set aside particular attractions, friendship relations, and even the love of humanity for the love committed to the recognition of the specific and emphatic otherness of each and every individual. As in all acts of love, infinite love is expressed in a relationship of selfhood in otherness. Only here, however, does love rest on a pure or infinite subjectivity, one expressed not in exclusive relations to those directed to the otherness of particularity, but in the absolute and unconditional love of all members of a kingdom of God. To be clear, Hegel's notion of cultic love is not principally the love shared by members of an already existing community of believers. Rather, the community generally and the cultists in particular are properly first constituted only in the love members have for one another. At issue is the mutual love of community, wherein the performatively enacted relations of mutuality denote the community itself. It's only in the love itself that you first have a community. It's not that there community, there is a community, but it's fully realized in the communal relations themselves. What Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit said about absolute spirit applies generally as well to its instantiation in a cultic community. It exists in relations of reciprocal recognition. So very quickly, here too, the cultic community is very much a practical phenomena, and the cultus itself only comes into existence through these relations of recognition. It is not this cognitive phenomena of recognizing a divinity already present in those practices. Part 3. Even if it be acknowledged that Hegel's understanding of cultic life supports an account of moral practical agency, I may be going a little long, but just continue. Okay, you tell me if it's too long. But even if it be acknowledged that Hegel's understanding of cultic life supports an account of moral practical agency, that agency may still be confined strictly to membership in other worldly religious communities and thus devoid of significance for everyday duties and responsibilities of members of modern societies. Indeed, by restricting such agency to the religious domain, Hegel may only further underwrite moral and political passivity as at the mundane level. According to Habermas, Hegel in fact espouses elements of this view when in the philosophy of religion he asserts that philosophy is, quote, an isolated order of priests, a sanctuary who are untroubled about how it goes with the world and who need not mix with it. How things turn out in the world is not our affair, end quote. Here too, though, Hegel's position is more nuanced than Habermas suggests. Regarding the claim that philosophy is an isolated sanctuary indifferent to the affairs of the world, Hegel also asserts in the immediately ensuing sentence that the worldly engagement is, quote, not the immediate practical business of philosophy. Yeah, philosophy is not immediately, directly concerned with the practical world, but that doesn't mean that it may not be indirectly concerned, which is what I believe he does maintain. In addition, it is basic to the very idea of a philosophy of spirit, one for which truth is a process, again, of substance becoming subject to itself, that any practical alteration of existing reality must be effectuated not through philosophical reflection alone, if at all, but through the practical agency of members of affected communities. Central here, again, is his account of Christianity. For Hegel, Christianity is predicated on the reconciliation of the finite and the infinite. Such reconciliation cannot be properly achieved, however, if religiosity is understood as a mode of belief and practice juxtaposed to mundane existence. Indeed, quote, this reconciliation should also be accomplished in the worldly realm, end quote. The principle of inward freedom articulated with Protestantism must acquire external expression as well. Nor does this just mean that a spirituality must infuse the subjective sentiment of believers' everyday life, Hegel's point against Catholicism. It also means that the spiritual must be coextensive with objective reality of the entire social order. Inward subjective freedom must, quote, develop into an objective phase, into legal, moral, religious, and not least into scientific actuality, end quote. Further, Christianity requires realization in an ethical account of political community, expressing thereby not only the conjunction of the finite and the infinite, but that of individual and community as well. Quoting here, the true reconciliation whereby the divine realizes itself consists in the ethical and juridical life of the state. Important in this regard, again, is Hegel's view of the cultus As we have seen, the concept of the cultus is central to Habermas's assessment of Hegel's position. That assessment focused on the cultus conceived principally as a community confined to the experience of the religious devout. By contrast, Hegel's view is much more expansive and requires that cultic activity not only engage with everyday social life, but does so in a way that achieves profane articulation for religious communities themselves. Members of a cultus are citizens of the kingdom of God who espouse a religiosity manifest in a mutual love reflected, among other things, in a commitment to their shared commonality. As citizens of a kingdom of God, however, that commitment cannot be restricted simply to their particular community, one demarcated from the institutions of the secular world. And as an expression of infinite and unconditioned love, it must encompass commitment to the ethicality of society as a whole. Quote, to that extent, ethical life is the most genuine cultus, end quote. In the words of the editors of the English translation of the Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion, quote, the various forms of ethical life, the family, civil society, and ultimately the state, all represent extensions of the religious cultus. Okay, I can go to the last section.
Yeah, I would do that. Yeah, because
okay. So the last section is a little more the final. For those, okay. Let's just move to section 5.
Vamos a ir a la sección 5 directamente. Página 21.
Okay. This is some more systematic, dare we say, philosophical issues comparing the two thinkers. So this section is called Habermas, Hegel, and the Dialectic of Religion and Secularity. More could be said about Hegel's, Habermas' particular reception of Hegel's position. In what remains, however, I consider some more systematic issues that compare the two thinkers' respective understanding of the relation of religion and secularity. Let me begin by noting that in concluding Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, Habermas asserts that religious experience remains, quote, a thorn in the flesh of the modern age, end quote. A very interesting statement for a thinker who's basically an atheist. He says that religion remains a thorn in the flesh of the modern age. Habermas thereby claims that such experience can continue to furnish normative resources that may productively question modes of social life conceived wholly in secular terms. Despite what Habermas suggests, Hegel, in his own account of religious experience, argues similarly, asserting very famously that religiosity is based on a notion that can serve as, quote, the rose and the cross of the present, end quote. Where Hegel differs in his understanding of the relationship between religious and secular considerations is an understanding of the relationship between religious and secular considerations in modern life. The point can be made first by considering an important element in Habermas's own treatment of the relationship of the sacred and profane, the question of the motivational basis for observing unconditionally binding norms. Why should we obey objective ethical norms? What's the motivation? In Habermas's view, a gap, lücke, exists between religious and secular accounts of norms. In religious traditions, the motivation to obey unconditionally or absolutely binding moral norms are rooted in an individual's acknowledgement of the power of a divine authority, one also able to ensure the promise of salvation. Such motivating forces weaken, however, in the transition to purely secular accounts of morality, those in which the binding nature of norms is conceived merely in terms of humanly self-imposed rules. Indeed, Habermas goes so far as to assert that the lack of sufficient motivational basis for norms of unconditional obligation is an embarrassment, Verlegenheit, for secular morality. This is a very stunning assertion for a secular moralist. He's basically saying that religious morality provides stronger motivational basis than secular morality. So Hegel advances a different view. Consider, for instance, the role played for him by mutual love in both religious and secular accounts of moral motivation. In each case, love affirms a view of self-interested motivation that goes hand in hand with unconditional respect for the other as other. This is not to deny a reality recognized by Hegel as well. In modern secular societies, self-interested motivation rarely takes the form of genuine respect for the other as other. I mean, that seems to be pretty obvious in our world. Yet to note the sociological reality is not to deny the conceptual point. For the latter, self-interested, properly understood, takes the form of the expanded or enlarged mentality Hegel calls universal self-consciousness, one that acknowledges and integrates into its own sense of self, affirmation of the other as other. On Hegel's recognitive account of self-identity, unconditional duty towards another is also a motivating force for one's interested self-realization. To paraphrase what Hegel calls his secular commandment of right, one can be a person oneself only if one recognizes the person of others. So in other words, for Hegel, self-interested goes hand in hand with some obligation to the other as other. That's at least the claim of Hegel. So in other words, Hegel can come up with a secular account for motivation for absolutely objectively binding norms that's still linked to individual self-interest. Underlying the difference between the two thinkers are differing views on the general relationship between the religious and the secular. For Hegel, a continuum exists between the two domains. In particular, Hegel maintains that the two domains are rooted in the one concept of freedom. It is his common commitment to the principle of freedom that permits the homology between the two domains as regards the principle of reciprocal recognition, its self-articulation of the notion of selfhood and otherness, concretizing Hegel's idea of freedom. But this commonality is less emblematic of Habermas's view. Although the concept of freedom is central, is of crucial importance to Habermas's genealogical account of the relationship of faith and knowledge, that concept is one directed to ridding human beings of the tutelage to religious and other externally imposed authorities. In line with his reception of the young Hegelians, that's Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, David Friedrich Strauss, and of course Karl Marx. These are the young Hegelians. In line with the young Hegelian criticism of Hegel, rational freedom is now understood solely in terms of the mundane and horizontally conceived interaction of what Habermas calls, quote, communicatively socialized, end quote, human beings. To be sure, he acknowledges that this communicatively conceived notion of freedom itself derives from religious sources, including the dialogical mediation of self and other, central to the Judeo-Christian accounts of the relationship of human beings and God. Still, if the genesis of a notion of rational freedom may be attributed to religious sources, its validity and proper nature are linked to strictly secular modes of self-understanding and collective self-formation. Habermas's genealogy of post-metaphysical thinking goes hand in hand with a repudiation of all forms of metaphysical reasoning, including those entwined with the religions of the axial age. None of this is to say that Hegel is not committed to an autonomized view of secular life himself. On the contrary, an indigenous conception of freedom is central to his idea of the nature and identity of a secular community. Not only does he claim that political community can be deemed free only as community members understand themselves as free, he claims as well that the legitimacy and even the reality of that community is affirmed only in the process of members autonomously constituting and reconstituting themselves as a community. Where Hegel differs from Habermas is that he does not regard the process of secularization as one in which religious modes of orientation are progressively supplanted by more mundane ways in which human beings relate to themselves and the world. Instead, Hegel's view, and this is the reason why he cannot be characterized as a theoretician of secularization, is that the historical learning process that forges the institutions of secular modernity that process is one that goes hand in hand with the progressive realization of religion itself. Here we leave aside his claim that the proper realization of a secular political community instantiates the self-consciousness of freedom expressive of absolute spirit. Instead, note should be made of Hegel's claim that the idea of absolute or infinite freedom, if it's not to be restricted by external constraints, must actualize itself in the spatio-temporally delimited world of human institutions. Quoting again, the true reconciliation with the divine realizes itself consists in the ethical and juridical life of the state, end quote. For his part, Habermas also maintains that a proper account of secularity itself must be understood in terms of an appropriation of insights derived from religion, specifically those introduced to civilization during the axial age. It is in this respect that he also departs from standard accounts of secularization. The difference, though, is that, and here I claim that Habermas deploys a dialectic that may out Hegel's own. I mean, Habermas here may be more Hegelian than Hegel himself. Habermas regards the historical appropriation of religious resources as part and parcel of the very diminution of the role of religion. So in other words, he invokes religion to overcome religion. Habermas's position stands thus in marked contrast to that of Hegel, for whom the secular appropriation of religious resources entails the further realization and enrichment of religion itself. So just a few more points here. The distinctiveness of Hegel's position may additionally be clarified by observing that for him, the progressive realization of religion in the secular world goes hand in hand with the progressive spiritualization of the secular itself. As noted, central elements of a legitimate secular moral political order include the following, and this is something we neglected, I didn't have time to discuss, but this is Hegel's position. Central elements of a legitimate secular political order include these religious principles: commitment to the rights and dignity of the particular individual, the idea of a political community rooted in political sentiment or the civic disposition of constituent members, the expectation that members of a community collectively attend to affairs that surpass their immediate self-interest, and the notion that the mediation of self and other needed for a genuine community is one effectuated by affected individuals themselves. As I argued, however, each of these features draws on insights and principles that for Hegel have been bequeathed to modern society by religion itself. For Hegel, for better or for worse, Hegel maintains that an affirmation of the legitimacy of the modern age, and that's the title of a very famous book by this German theoretician Hans Blumenberg. Hegel maintains the legitimacy of the modern age is at the same time affirmation of a religious view of the world. So it's very dialectical. Secular and religion go hand in hand. For better or for worse. Maybe it doesn't work, but that's his position. The specific difference between Habermas and Hegel may be noted by acknowledging one other general commonality. Both see religion as a source of meaning, one that in Habermas's words supplies human being with a holistic understanding of self and world. In addition, both see in the spirituality of religion resources by which to affirm the dignity and autonomy against reductionistic, naturalistic, scientific understanding of human beings and the world. Yet the differences are also telling. In his appropriation of the element of religious traditions, Habermas is not calling for a reaffirmation of religion itself. Rather, religion is invoked as something of a heuristic device, one that might help with the real task at hand to, quote, encourage. He just wants to encourage us, encourage fellow students to make use, especially in light of the dominance of techno-scientific understandings of experience and reality. Encourage citizens to use their rational freedom and their collective capacity for moral, political self-determination. By contrast, Hegel maintains that the defense of human autonomy requires a more unabashed affirmation of the resource of religion. Public autonomy, on his view, involves robust process of collective self-reflection, self-clarification, and self-apprehension, and these are best achieved by engaging the modes of absolute spirit. This includes not only religion, but art and philosophy, that Hegel subsumes under the general category of philosophy. So we really can't have democratic self-autonomy unless we make use of philosophy, religion, and art. And these have to be included. We're not just encouraged, they're required. So it's through religion, according to Hegel, that, quote, a nation defines what it considers to be true, end quote. Here, too, robust affirmation of rational freedom for Hegel goes hand in hand with a robust affirmation of religion itself. So, okay, one final paragraph then. I conclude by turning again to Habermas's position. In the postscript to Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, he writes that the central goal of the work is, quote, to present the process of migration of theological contents into profane thinking as a philosophically comprehensible learning process, end quote. In this way, he describes an undertaking whose elements are discernible in Hegel as well. Yet the differences in the two approaches are also evident. In a review, Peter Gordon argues that Habermas's understanding of the relation of the religious resources to secular thinking is unidirectional. At issue is how the content of religious traditions, even in their diminution, have shaped and can shape modern secular life and the idea of post-metaphysical reason itself. By contrast, Hegel's position can be carried as multi-directional. While he does maintain that the insights of theological traditions have decisively shaped elements of modern profane life, he maintains further that those elements have also decisively shaped religious traditions. Hegel would likely agree with Habermas and Habermas's teacher Adorno in claiming that the content of religious tradition cannot undergo secular migration without being transformed. But for Hegel, the issue is not just transformation, but actualization as well. The distinctive multi-directionality of Hegel's position lies in the view that just as a secular polity depends for its proper actualization on the resource of religion, so the realization of religion itself depends on the institution of a properly realized secular polity. This is basic to the view that religion finds its proper realization in philosophy, but it is also basic to the view that religion depends on political community. For Hegel, religion achieves its realization in a modern polity. Engagement with religion is itself occasioned by the needs of a modern polity, and that engagement, in turn, depends on the political and juridical resources of a modern polity. So, thank you, and I thank you really for your attention. The fact, I guess I went on a little longer. I hope I didn't try your patience too much, so thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrew, por este magnífico estudio y esta, la verdad, en primer lugar, sorprendente. Nos has descubierto una visión sorprendente de Habermas. Los que no hemos leído este libro, la verdad es que también nos sorprendemos al reconocer pues su caída en posiciones poco racionales y también, pues, por ejemplo, su ensalzamiento, ¿no?, de pensadores como Schleiermacher, considerado más moderno que Hegel. Son cosas realmente increíbles, ¿no? Pero no solo es interesante tu paper en el sentido de la crítica a Habermas, sino también de esa comparación final que nos ayuda a entender por qué quizás esa noción multidireccional de Hegel o esa comprensión multidireccional de las relaciones entre filosofía y religión puede ser más apropiada para entender el proceso de secularización y nuestras propias sociedades contemporáneas que esa visión unidireccional de Habermas, ¿no? Very briefly in English, thank you. It was really nice and very interesting for us who haven't read the book, Habermas' book, to discover such an irrational Habermas, who even praises Schleiermacher over Hegel as more modern. But not only the critiques were really interesting for us, but also the comparison you established in the end that really makes us understand how Hegel's conception of the relationship between religion and knowledge or politics in general is not a unidirectional, compared to the unidirectional vision of Habermas, are maybe more useful to understand our own society and the process of secularization. Yo tengo muchas preguntas, I have many questions, pero seguro que hay en el público alguna pregunta, alguna cuestión. Sí, tenemos aquí una señora. De momento, tiene usted la palabra y luego seguimos.
Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes.
Yo creo que sí.
Bueno, pues nada, muy buenas tardes. Y es la primera vez que me pasa, es que yo no sé inglés. Y entonces, pues como no veo, pues entonces no he podido leer, no me he enterado de la conferencia, pero bueno, un poco más o menos quería hacerle a este señor una pregunta. Y es la siguiente: en este pugilato, ¿quién gana? ¿Habermas o Hegel? En este pugilato dialéctico, ¿se entiende? Y luego, Hegel, para Hegel, la fe es un estado mental, no es un sentimiento. Entonces ahí yo me gustaría que este señor me dijera si está en contra, hay un enfrentamiento entre Hegel, Jacobi, Schleiermacher y todos estos ilustrados alemanes, que yo creo que ahí no estaban de acuerdo. Y luego entre la fe y saber, evidentemente, Hegel lo único que nos dice es que, claro, la religión y todo está en el saber absoluto. Pero casi toda su filosofía, también me gustaría que me diera este señor, y sobre todo la teología, es que es el empeño de Hegel por no separar, por conciliar lo finito con lo infinito. Y eso es lo que en Hegel hace hincapié, y sobre todo es muy crítico con la Ilustración y sobre todo con algunos ilustrados también alemanes. Muchísimas gracias, esto lo leeré en casa. Y bueno, es que no tengo más preguntas porque, claro...
Bueno, hay una pregunta.
No he podido leer y claro...
Pero sí ha entendido, yo creo, muchas cosas. So, very quickly, the question is, in this boxing, if you had to say, in this boxing match, if you had to say who wins, Habermas or Hegel, in the end, I mean, I can think what your answer will be, but who wins? Would you say like that Hegel wins, period, or more? And then this lady, yes, she asked, no, if for Hegel faith is more a mental state than a feeling, so she in a way agrees with the cognitive position of Habermas of faith or religion being more cognitive. Would you say that Hegel is clearly against Jacobi or Schleiermacher about these putting these feelings, these sentiments against faith? And then, I mean, these are just reflections, not questions, but she was also commenting on Hegel's conception of absolute spirit as non-separation between finite and infinite in general, spheres, which she thinks is, and she is right, one of the most important traits of Hegel's philosophy. But the main question is the first one. Would you say that there is a clear defeated and one winner?
Maybe I won't say that anybody is defeated. I won't say that anybody loses. But if and I think this is might follow from my presentation, if there is a winner, it will be Hegel. I say this for two reasons. One is just I'm personally disposed to Hegel. Hegel is a dialectical thinker. We were talking about the other day, as some of you know, the watchword for dialectic is as well as rather than either or, right? And so at every level, individual and community, self and other, thought and being, Hegel always tries to overcome what he calls ruinous dualisms while at the same time preserving the differences. And I personally am just attracted to that. That's probably why I was attracted to Hegel. And I don't know why I'm attracted to it, but that's so. And Habermas is more dualistic, you know. So that's one thing I'm attracted to. But more systematically here, you know, this whole issue of religion in the public sphere. Habermas wants to include religious believers. He wants a more robust, inclusive public sphere. But it's basically only if religious people become pretty secular, you know. So, I mean, he wants to call on the resources of religion, and he wants secular types to realize there's these traditions, and so should be more respectful of people of faith. But people of faith themselves have to be more deferential to secular societies, and ultimately can only really participate if they acknowledge that their positions can be falsified. And for most religions, there are certain elements that are beyond falsification. I mean, you know, that Christ died for our sins. I mean, is that falsifiable? You know, so Habermas wants to accommodate the religious, but I don't think enough. Whereas I think Hegel is making a greater effort to accommodate the religious, even as he's saying that the religion has to better articulate itself in secular terms. So Hegel is more committed to finding a more complete mediation. So those are two reasons why I think Hegel wins. One, I just happen to better like his approach. And two, I think to the whole project. I mean, if Habermas wants to better incorporate the religion in the public sphere, I think Hegel has more resource to offer for that. As for, do you want, I can...
Yes, or is it long? Were you going to say?
Well, then those other 2 points, or at least the, oh yeah, the ambition about faith and cognition. I mean, one of the, yeah, I mean, it is a little tricky. I say that Hegel's is not a narrowly epistemic cognitive view, but that's not to say that he doesn't emphasize rationality and cognition. It's only because he understands cognition in a way that also includes practical action. He doesn't accept the separation. The big criticism of Hegel's philosophy of religion, is that he eliminates religion. People say that religion is based on matters of faith that don't lend themselves to reason. You know, faith is something that's not rational. And Hegel claims that, you know, in Hegel's absolute spirit, there's the art, religion, and philosophy. And religion has to sublate itself in philosophy. In philosophy, religion only fully realizes itself when it takes the form of philosophy. And so a lot of people said, well, that's not what religion is to me. So it is cognitive. I understand his notion of cognitive faith. Well, it is cognitive, but in a way that I think it's also very more broadly practical. But yeah, it's a, I mean, there's the big debate. Karl Löwit, the very famous interpreter of 19th century thought, said the question, does Hegel realize religion or does he destroy it altogether? The destruction of religion, I mean, it's hard to say that religion as an overarching source of meaning for human beings, I don't know if that exists anymore, you know, in the way it exists in the Middle Ages, you know. And the person who ultimately destroyed it, according to Löwit, is Hegel, because he sublated. In order to achieve religion, he said it had to take the form of philosophy, but in taking the form of philosophy, it ceased to be philosophy. So, but that's not to say that one should go back to the Gefühl's theology of Schleiermacher either. So, I mean, there's a whole other story where Hegel says that faith itself, the supreme faith is Protestantism. But Protestant introduced the idea that the priesthood of the believer, and nothing can be accepted that's not justified by insight. So faith itself for Protestantism is itself rational. So, you know, the relationship of faith and reason is just a very complicated issue for Hegel. But the end result is that if religion is understood as a faith juxtaposed to reason and religion, that would be Schleiermacher, and it's not Hegel. And if that's how you understand faith, which is perhaps how most people do, then Hegel's not for them.
Yes.
And there was a question about the absolute, but I'm not sure what that was.
I think you already answered it. En la respuesta, claro, él dice que, ante su pregunta, dice que probablemente si se pregunta quién gana en este boxeo, lo primero que hay que decir es que no hay un claro perdedor, pero él sí diría que el ganador es Hegel, y fundamentalmente por dos razones. Uno, por la propia disposición personal del profesor Buchwalter, que prefiere a Hegel en cuanto pensador dialéctico que tiene en el centro de su filosofía la expresión más bien en la misma medida que, y no tanto o esto o lo otro, y por lo tanto intenta conciliar siempre las diferencias, ¿no? Por ejemplo, el ser y el pensar, el individuo y la comunidad, o en este caso la fe y el saber. Por lo tanto, esta idea de algún modo dar cuenta de las diferencias es algo que siempre le ha atraído frente al dualismo de Habermas, en ese sentido más heredero de Kant, ¿no? Y luego la segunda razón por la que prefiere a Hegel es la cuestión por la cuestión que ha tratado en este paper, que es la religión, la cuestión de la religión en la esfera pública, ¿no? Habermas, de algún modo, quiere incluir a los creyentes en la esfera pública, pero solo en la medida en que los creyentes acepten, de algún modo, secularizarse. ¿Y qué implica secularizarse? Implica admitir que todas sus creencias son falsables, o algunas de sus creencias básicas son falsables. Pero claro, la naturaleza del dogma es justamente la infalsabilidad, el no estar dispuesto a renunciar a alguno de los propios creencias. Y por lo tanto es más difícil para el creyente aceptar esta concepción habermasiana de la inclusión de la religión en la esfera pública a través de la secularización que la de Hegel, que de manera más sistemática y más compleja posibilita una cierta coexistencia multidireccional entre fe y saber. O sea, él piensa que Hegel hizo un mayor esfuerzo que Habermas, cuyo tratamiento es más simple, ¿no? Sobre la cuestión de lo que significa un enfoque cognitivo de la religión, lo que él sostiene es que cognitivo no equivale a exclusivamente racional, ¿no? Sino que lo cognitivo tiene también una parte, o mejor dicho, lo racional no equivale solo a lo cognitivo, sino que contiene también una parte práctica, una dimensión práctica que es fundamental, como se ha visto en toda la sección del culto, ¿no? Es decir, en el espíritu absoluto, para Hegel hay una realización, y aquí aprovecho para disculparme porque en la traducción había un error repetido y es que se traducía realización como materialización, pero bueno, esto lo corregiremos. Hay una realización de la religión en la filosofía y esto normalmente suele disgustar a los creyentes, ¿no? Pero depende de cómo se entienda esta realización. Ya Karl Löwitz suscitó el debate sobre si esta realización era una supresión de la religión en la filosofía. Y esto, claro, depende de cómo se entienda, ¿no? Löwitz sí entiende que es así, pero para muchos otros, sin embargo, es una conservación del contenido de la religión bajo una forma filosófica. Por lo tanto, si se sigue manteniendo esa separación entre sentimiento por un lado y razón por otra, en referirse a la fe, pues más bien estaríamos recayendo en un Schleiermacher, ¿no? ¿Por qué le gusta a Hegel el protestantismo como religión más alta? Justamente porque es la más racional, la más autotransparente, y por lo tanto dice que el resultado final pues es esta preferencia en general por Hegel por todas estas razones, y le agradezco mucho la pregunta. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Any other question? Hay una aquí. Había una pregunta aquí, una aquí y una aquí. Yo creo que tampoco tenemos muchísimo tiempo para las preguntas. No sé, Antonio, si tú quieres... Sí. Venga, como tú quieras. Como tú quieras, Antonio, estás en tu casa. Antonio is a very important scholar and the translator of the Phenomenology of Spirit into Spanish. So, Esto para crear expectativas. El traductor de la fenomenología del espíritu al español.
Translate the Habermas book?
Es el que va a traducir el libro de Habermas.
Next slide. My next slide.
Pero como quieras, Antonio, ¿eh? Si quieres yo traduzco lo que tú prefieras.
No, lo hago en inglés rápido y luego me traduzco a mí mismo, ya, por ahorrarte trabajo. It's two very silly questions in any case. The first one, I basically agree with your interpretation of Hegel. I think it's the way we are reading it now here. My question is, I'm just curious about that. I have seen, that's a very American interpretation. And in Germany, they used to read Hegel much more critically, like Habermas.
The what?
I think this idea that Hegel is actually, Hegel's philosophy can be realized in modern democracy. I mean, that you can find...
In Germany, they're more critical
people like Habermas, like Hornet, they can find...
States or...
Which is the reason for that? You think that you in America can be much more positive than the Germans in reading Hegel? And the other question, well, you touched it before when you said that Protestantism is the highest religion for Hegel. Well, I understand this dialectic of politics and of modern state and modern society and religion, Hegel, but that goes only for Protestantism. And you have many more religions still today which didn't experience this historical development like Christianity in Protestantism. And still, what do you think of the fact that in modern society there are many individuals, especially in modern secularized society, who feel attracted by Oriental religions, especially by Buddhism? Like it's Western Buddhism which somehow accommodates very well to these modern pluralistic societies, not Protestantism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe he could self-translate.
Bueno, la traducción muy rápida, ahora lo diré mejor. La primera pregunta es que la interpretación que hacen en Estados Unidos de Hegel suele ser la de Pinkard, por ejemplo, es mucho menos crítica que en Alemania, donde son más críticos con Hegel, ¿no? Siempre piensan que Hegel se quedó atrás frente a la modernidad, ¿no? Esa es la primera cuestión. ¿Cuál es la razón por la que en Estados Unidos son más positivos hacia Hegel que en Alemania? La segunda cuestión es que el esquema de Hegel que nos ha presentado funciona muy bien con el protestantismo, pero hay otras religiones, no solo el catolicismo quizá más, pero religiones orientales que no se adaptan tan bien, no se acomodan a la sociedad moderna. Y en particular, en relación con eso, preguntaba qué opina del hecho de que en las sociedades occidentales modernas hay ciertas formas de budismo, por ejemplo, de religión oriental, que parecen tener mucho atractivo para individuos secularizados, ¿no?
Okay, yeah, very interesting point. It is true that there is this distinction between the different appropriations of Hegel today. In the U.S., there's a tendency to reject the metaphysical Hegel and focus on practical issues, the sociology of reason that you mentioned in Terry Pinkard and Pippin, and then this guy, Robert Brandon. So yeah, there's in the Anglo-American appropriation, there's a greater effort to appropriate Hegel. Maybe that's too typically American or something. In Germany, I think it's sort of split. On the one hand, you have this one group of Hegelians that are, more typically philological, historical, and so the actual appropriation, whether it's democratic or not democratic, doesn't even concern them because Hegel was not, he was living at a different time. I think Ludwig Siep is a little more like that. And then the people who are interested in appropriation are people like the Frankfurt School, not just Habermas, but his student Honneth. And they all have bought into the early Frankfurt School, which goes back to Marxism, which goes back to the young Hegelians, that there's a problem with Hegel. And so any appropriation, you can't really, the position is too tainted with conservatism and, of absolute spirit and monarchicalism, that it can't really be appropriated. So, yeah, it's sort of curious. I mean, that on the one hand, there's the group of Hegelians, the orthodox Hegelians, that really aren't interested in the contemporary appropriation, and the ones that are the more conservative. And, you know, Hegel is, Habermas is, in his early writings, he liked the Jena writings of Hegel, but in this stuff, he says even the Jena writings in the 1805, 1810, even that's no longer any good. Habermas wants to go back to the early writings when Hegel was 15 or something, when there was something, I'm exaggerating, when he was 20 or something. I didn't, you know, I have utmost, I personally know Habermas, I've translated Habermas, I admire his politics, but he's fixated with this idea of the philosophy of the subject. In order to defend his own conception of intersubjectivity, he has to, as superior to what went before, he has to brand Hegel as a philosopher of the subject. And so, however great a interpreter of the history of philosophy he is, that's sort of a stereotypical pigeonholed view where he imposes on Hegel this problematic view. I don't really understand it because he should know, I mean, the stuff I was pointing out is not, it's all in the text, you know. So where does, you know, he has to say that Hegel is committed to the constitutional monarchy because that fits this doctrine of the philosophy of the subject, you know. So I don't really, you know, I'm not going to say that the American interpretation is necessarily better because I've written some critical things about some of them, but I like the idea of the more productive appropriation of Hegel, which is what they have. Oh yeah, as for, you know, the whole project, Hegel's whole project, it fell apart. I mean, the project here, I didn't have time to talk about it. Hegel was this amazing thing there. He wanted to combine Christian theology and Enlightenment Republican politics. I mean, that's this incredible thing, but nobody believed it. None of even his own students didn't believe it. And at the time, all the traditionalists said, well, we don't want Republican politics. And all the people committed to social change, like Feuerbach and Marx, they said we don't need Christian dogma. So this whole grand synthesis of Christian theology and politics, which is, I think, they were in Hegel. That was the project. It never worked or wasn't convincing. But Hegel nonetheless felt that Christianity, because of the incarnation, was able to exhibit this principle of dialectics, you know, the unity and difference. You know, I mean, Nietzsche said it was just all mystical hocus pocus, you know, that God becomes man, man becomes God. I mean, where did that come from? According to Nietzsche, of course. But for Hegel, you know, there's that idea of the finite and the infinite and the finite. I mean, Kierkegaard wrote the either or. You know, the finite or the infinite. For Hegel, the whole point is the reconciliation of those two. And he found that that was unique to the Christian incarnation, which was best expressed in Protestantism. He had some pretty negative, he had, you know, and he had this view of history where Buddhism was sort of an earlier stage of religion. And he felt that Christianity was the absolute religion, you know. And, you know, that's really problematic. But, you know, his original view is that Christianity itself emerged between East and West. You know, and so people say, well, even though he seemed to champion Christianity, you might still become able to come up with a post-Christian Hegelian religiosity tries to synthesize other traditions. That would be another how can one appropriate Hegel's philosophy of religion given it has some of these problems? So, okay, I don't know, poor Valerio has to, I don't know.
I invent everything you say.
Oh, yeah,
so
okay.
I say something totally different.
Okay, yeah. I thought so. It sounded a little funny, but okay.
Yes.
So.
Bien. A la primera pregunta, ¿no?, sobre la diferencia entre la apropiación o la lectura estadounidense y alemana, él, claro, piensa que en Estados Unidos se tiende a rechazar el contenido metafísico de la filosofía de Hegel y más bien pensar la filosofía de una manera práctica, ¿no?, como en el caso de Pippin, Brandon. Y esto obliga quizás a un esfuerzo para apropiarse de Hegel, que es en general una actitud bastante americana, esta de apropiarse de las cosas, ¿no? Mientras que, eso lo ha dicho él, no lo he dicho yo.
What was that?
Lo ha dicho, you said that the Americans tend to appropriate things. ¿Qué pasa con Alemania? Que claro, el panorama está más dividido, ¿no? Porque por un lado hay un paradigma más filológico, más histórico, representado por ejemplo por Ludwig Sieb, que se hacen preguntas del tipo, ¿se puede decir que Hegel era democrático? Vayamos a ver los textos, ¿no? Vayamos directamente a las fuentes y tal. Y luego, en cambio, frente a estos ortodoxos también hay una rama más de apropiación, pero claro, ahí tienen toda la dificultad del peso de esa tradición que empieza con los jóvenes hegelianos, que pasa evidentemente por Marx, el marxismo, etcétera, que llega a la escuela de Frankfurt y que tiene una visión tendencialmente negativa, conservadora de Hegel, especialmente de su idea del Estado y del espíritu absoluto. Por lo tanto, aunque lo intentes apropiar, tienes que luchar con toda esta tradición que en Alemania pesa mucho más, ¿no? Habermas, por ejemplo, no para de ir hacia atrás en el tiempo. Antes le parecía que el Hegel de Jena era potable y decente, y ahora ya dice que no, que ni siquiera el Hegel de Jena, que hay que ir a cuando Hegel tenía 15 años. By the way, you know, I translated the texts in the gymnasium that Hegel wrote when he was 14 and 15. Yo traduje los primeros textos de Hegel cuando tenía 14 y 15 años. Very important text. O sea que estoy de acuerdo con... Y claro, Habermas está obsesionado con esta idea de la filosofía del sujeto, ¿no? Le acusa de ser un filósofo del sujeto porque esto casa para su propia visión de la filosofía de la historia, pero para él, de la historia de la filosofía, pero para él es una visión muy estereotipada. Y ha dicho que mientras que lo que él ha explicado en la conferencia está todo respaldado por los textos de Hegel, con Habermas a veces se tiene la sensación de que eso no es así, ¿no? Por lo tanto, no dice que la visión de Estados Unidos sea la mejor tal cual, pero que quizá pueda ser más productiva hoy en día. Y con respecto a la segunda pregunta, que es, digamos, la de la posibilidad, qué ocurre con las religiones orientales, el budismo, etc. Claro, dice que Hegel intentó combinar dos polos muy difíciles de combinar, la teología cristiana por una parte y el republicanismo de origen ilustrado por otro, ¿no? Pero nadie le creyó. O sea, a nadie le gustó esto porque a todos sus sucesores o bien les disgustaba un polo o les disgustaba el otro, ¿no? A nadie quería conciliar estos dos polos que él, sin embargo, intentaba todo el rato conciliar. Por ejemplo, ¿por qué le gusta la encarnación? Porque nos permite conciliar la idea de lo finito y de lo infinito, la idea de lo individuo, de la idea de lo universal, de lo humano y lo divino. Y frente a ello, sin embargo, su proyecto fracasó porque justo después pensadores como Kierkegaard escribieron textos llamados justamente Entweder oder, es decir, out, es decir, o esto o aquello, o la fe o la filosofía, ¿no? Por lo tanto, y luego, claro, está el problema del pensamiento, la filosofía de la historia de Hegel, y es que el budismo es una filosofía oriental, es una filosofía anterior y por lo tanto de algún modo es inferior, y en ese sentido, pues Hegel quizás no pueda servir mucho para esto, pero es verdad que dice Andrew que él piensa que el cristianismo, una especie de cristianismo nacido a mitad entre lo oriental y lo occidental, y que por lo tanto eso sí que pueda servir para una visión más amplia de lo cristiano, que no sea meramente lo protestante o lo católico, sino un poco más cosmopolita. Muy bien. So, we had one question here. We don't have much time, so let's be brief in the questions and in the answers.
I'm a little troubled by what seems like absolute freedom in a world community seems to be at odds with each other. I'm not really hearing a resolution between these two thinkers and the fact that communities become selves in and of themselves, motivated by their own interests and self-interest of the community. And, you know, how or what would these thinkers or you say about the failures of freedom when communities, whether they're religious communities, political entities, sovereign nations, etc., exert and exact their freedom absolutely onto others?
Sí, muy brevemente, claro, está preocupada o no entiende del todo el concepto de libertad absoluta de Hegel en el contexto actual. en el sentido de que hoy en día seguimos teniendo comunidades que entienden más bien la libertad como una liberación a partir de sus propios intereses, liberación frente a otros, ¿no? Que pueden alcanzar solo la libertad como liberarse de, ¿no? Y entonces, cómo Hegel da respuesta a esta concepción de la libertad como liberación. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, okay, very interesting question. Very contemporary question, too. The question is, I mean, it's always how would Hegel analyze current developments? My view is that he would probably, first there would be the analysis and then the normative critique. The analysis would be that we are still dealing with the aftermath of excessive individualism, atomistic individualism, which is the legacy of modern liberal political thinking. Again, not that Hegel rejected modern notions of freedom. He champions the idea of subjective freedom, which he links up with Protestantism. But we have an atrophied notion of freedom where it's so individualistic that and that's dissatisfying to people. And so the only alternative, if that's what freedom is this narrow individualism, then it's not surprising that people latch on to tribalistic notions of community, that juxtapose tribal communities to individuals. I don't know what Hegel might say to current populism, but I would say that he might see this as not as a critique of modern individualism, but just a further development of its implications. The response then is to articulate a different notion of individual freedom. I talked about this a little bit, the recognitive view of freedom, where one is most free, and this goes back to the concept of love, too. Love infuses his concept of recognition, that one is a self, only in as much as one finds oneself in the other, and not just finds oneself in the other, but then is committed to achieving, supporting relations that foster that type of intersubjectivity. And that would be the solution. Hegel's solution, I think, is interesting because he's not rejecting individualism. He's not saying, we just have to go to this different view of community against individuals, because that's contributing to the problem, too. We have to somehow get people to better appreciate that one's own identity is bound up with others. And so, sure, we have a community, but it's much more differentiated, non-tribalistic community. And that works not only for individual communities, but I think Valerio mentioned that I did this book on Hegel and Global Justice. I think some of these same arguments could be extended to the global community, where communities are not broken down into these tribal, narrowly sovereign entities, but clearly depend on one another for their various. You look at all the crises, the environmental crisis, the nuclear crisis, the war and peace now. All these are based on these sort of truncated notion of self, whether it's individual or communities. And so maybe it's odd to say that Hegel's too ideal. Well, he's an idealist, but not. He also tries to be very worldly, so that's my view. That's the source of the problem. And the solution requires not jettisoning individuals, but coming up with a richer, more expansive view based on recognition and, proper understanding, proper education. This is not so ridiculous. People can be made to realize that their self-interest is bound up with the welfare of others. It's not that radical of a notion, but we have advertising, we have economics that moves us in opposite directions. So that's my religious sermon.
Dice que es una pregunta muy buena, muy contemporánea y que está en general centrada en cómo analizar a Hegel, los desarrollos contemporáneos a partir de Hegel, ¿no? Según él y según Hegel, somos presos de un exceso de individualismo fruto del ultraliberalismo, ¿no? Tenemos, por tanto, una libertad decepcionante, una noción de libertad muy decepcionante y muy pobre, que es mero individualismo, y eso lleva a una decepción que lleva a muchos a buscar la libertad en la comunidad y en una concepción, de algún modo, tribal de la comunidad, ¿no? De alguna manera, el populismo, en este sentido, no es sino la exacerbación de las lógicas del individualismo, porque conduce a este buscar la libertad en el pueblo, ¿no? Él piensa, como Hegel, que por lo tanto hay que desarrollar otra noción de libertad entendida a partir del reconocimiento y del amor, como ese ser sí mismo en otro, como decía en la conferencia, es decir, un crear relaciones de algún modo de apoyo mutuo. No hay que rechazar el individualismo como tal, porque eso es una estrategia poco fina, sino que hay que insistir en crear comunidades no tribalizadas que estén basadas en el reconocimiento tanto en lo local como en lo global. En ese sentido, en el libro Hegel and Global Justice, él lo analizaba, esta necesidad de dar respuesta a la crisis nuclear, ambiental, las guerras, desde una perspectiva global y comunitaria y, desde luego, no individualista. Y en ese sentido, dice que Hegel puede ser un filósofo idealista, pero también es muy concreto y muy apegado a los problemas de nuestro mundo, que sus respuestas no son para nada ridículas, sino muy factibles y que simplemente hay que creérselas. Última pregunta, muy breve. Teníamos una aquí delante, pero no sé si... no, tenía usted una pregunta, ¿no?
Sí. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por la conferencia. Buenas tardes. Quería preguntarles lo siguiente. El texto de la conferencia del estudio en general se deduce que una manifestación del absoluto tiene lugar, utilizando la terminología marxista, en el constructo religioso. Concretamente, en Occidente tenemos el cristianismo, a diferencia del budismo e hinduismo, que son cosmogonías, no son religiones, no son cosmovisiones. Bien, la inserción que hace, Hegel, dentro del individuo, de esta manifestación singularizada del absoluto en cuanto religión, y a su vez, de forma sensible, los sacramentos, lo que implica el amor, no solamente para sí mismo, sino para con los demás, cómo se conecta a su vez esta íntima libertad característica de esa creación que para mí es magnífica, que es el protestantismo, cómo se conecta, insisto, con esta vinculación y esta obediencia, casi, como bien dice el texto, al Estado absoluto, a la creación del Estado absoluto. Y si esta conestación se basa en el derecho natural al que se puede considerar su creador, que fue también el alemán Samuel Buchwalter. ¿Cómo se conecta? Si es que hay una conexión tal.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias. So one remark at the beginning, she says that while Protestantism and Christianity, in her view, is a manifestation of the absolute in the individual, and the community, so Christianism, and therefore it's a religion, we should understand that Oriental philosophies like Buddhism, etc., are not religions but cosmovisions, because they are not realizations of the absolute, she says. But her concrete question is, how is it possible that Hegel fosters a conception of freedom through religion and Protestantism, and at the same time defends a conception of state where individual freedom, according to her, is not that possible? And if this has something to do, she asks, with Pufendorf's notion of natural law. So it's a very complex question. I think you can take from it whatever you want, and shortly, because we...
Okay. I don't really know what to say about Buddhism. I mean, I have to confess I haven't studied that much. I did hear she was, did talk about sort of, it's more of a natural religion, and, well, maybe it's not a religion. You know, a religion that, I don't know if she's saying that, I mean, there's certain visions of Buddhism that would see a greater spirituality in nature, in the world. And that's a position more typically ascribed to Schelling, and Schopenhauer articulated things like that as well. That was not Hegel. Hegel very famously said, nature does not exist, you know, so because whatever exists is the unity of concept and existence, and nature doesn't have the concept in itself. So Hegel sometimes invoked for environmental philosophy because he sees spirit in nature, but he didn't see that. So, but okay, I'm not quite sure. I just don't know enough about his Buddhism. As for freedom, I didn't quite get the point, because Hegel certainly criticizes deficient notions of freedom, but he did feel, and this was sometimes the problem, he felt that freedom could be realized in the world. This is why Kierkegaard, for instance, didn't like him, because Hegel had this totally secular vision of human fulfillment. And you know, religious philosophers of Kierkegaard and other persuasions rejected that. But Hegel clearly felt that a comprehensive account of freedom was possible, and one way that is possible by tapping the resources of religion, which empower that notion. So that was part of the paper that we didn't really discuss that much. But yeah, Hegel was very critical of deficient notions of freedom, but he did feel that a more holistic account was possible and desirable, based on a comprehensive, this idea of Sittlichkeit, based on the unity of individual and community, and that notion itself derived from religion. So, well, there was one other point.
I think it's more or less what she was asking.
Okay,
Muchísimas gracias. Dice que bueno, no saben bien qué decir sobre el budismo, tampoco lo he estudiado mucho, ¿no? Hegel piensa que es efectivamente una religión natural, una religión oriental, que corresponde al primer estadio de la historia. Lo que sería interesante ver es comparar la concepción que tiene Hegel de estas religiones orientales con respecto a lo que opinan, por ejemplo, Schelling o Schopenhauer, que son entusiastas hacia ellas por el gran rol que dan a la naturaleza, mientras que Hegel dijo, como se sabe de manera famosa, que la naturaleza no existe, porque no existe no tiene un concepto en sí misma, ¿no? Por lo tanto, aquí digamos que se mueve un poco con dudas, porque dice que tampoco sabe lo suficiente sobre budismo, pero agradece mucho la pregunta. Y sobre el tema de la libertad, claro, dice que Hegel de facto criticó las concepciones deficientes de la libertad en diferentes sentidos, porque él sí pensaba que la libertad en todos sus aspectos podía conseguirse en este mundo a través de una noción de comunidad político-religiosa que efectivamente lo hiciera efectiva en este mundo, ¿no? Y esto no le gusta a los pensadores religiosos, que en cambio siempre la posponen a otra vida, aún más allá, ¿no? Entonces, a través de la noción de Sittlichkeit, de vida ética o eticidad, pues se puede efectivamente lograr una conciliación entre individuo y comunidad, que sería la libertad. Así que muchas gracias por la pregunta. Sé que habría muchas otras preguntas, pero el tiempo se nos ha echado encima. Muchísimas gracias al profesor Andrew Buchwalter, que aquí tiene su casa y que puede regresar cuando quiera. Y muchas gracias también a todos ustedes.